The city had already fallen. Smoke rose above the rooftops. The sound of battle had faded, replaced by something far worse. Silence. Inside the shattered palace, one woman stood frozen as soldiers moved through the halls where royal ceremonies had once taken place. She had seen everything. The gates breaking, the palace guards cut down, the royal court collapsing in a single night. But surviving the massacre did not mean freedom, because the conquerors had already decided her fate. She would live, not as a queen, not even as a prisoner who could one day return home, but as a witness to the destruction of her entire world. And she would never be allowed to leave. For centuries, the royal palace had stood at the center of the kingdom's power. Its walls were thick stone, its gates guarded by loyal soldiers. Inside its halls lived the royal court, nobles, advisors, servants, and the queen who ruled beside the king. But on one terrible night that world collapsed. The invading army arrived faster than anyone expected. Scouts had reported movement near the borders, but no one believed the enemy could reach the capital so quickly. By the time the alarm bells rang, the city gates were already under attack. Flames began to rise along the outer districts. The palace guards rushed to defend the royal compound, forming desperate lines in the courtyards. But the attackers were too many, too organized. The defenders fought fiercely, but the outcome became clear within hours. The capital was falling. Inside the palace, panic spread through the corridors. Servants ran through the halls. Advisors shouted conflicting orders. Members of the royal family tried to gather valuables and sacred relics that symbolized their dynasty. And in the center of it all stood the queen. She watched from the palace balcony as the city burned. The streets below filled with soldiers wearing the banners of the invading empire. The sound of fighting grew closer with every passing minute. Soon the palace gates themselves were under attack. Heavy rams struck the wood. Arrows flew across the courtyard. The royal guards made their final stand at the entrance to the inner halls. But by dawn, the battle was over. The palace doors were broken. The defenders lay silent. And the conquerors were already walking through the chambers where the kingdom had once ruled. The queen had witnessed everything. The fall of the city. The death of loyal defenders. The moment her dynasty disappeared forever. But the strangest part of her story was not the massacre itself. It was what happened afterward, because the conquerors made a decision that would define the rest of her life. They would not execute her. They would not exile her. Instead, they would keep her alive. And from that moment forward, she would never leave the empire that had destroyed her world. By the time the sun rose over the ruined capital, the fighting had ended. Smoke drifted through the streets where houses had burned during the night. The city that had once been filled with merchants, music, and royal ceremonies now stood silent beneath the shadow of occupation. Inside the palace, the conquerors moved carefully through the halls. The battle had been brutal. Broken shields and fallen guards still lay scattered across the marble floors where the royal defenders had made their last stand. Torn banners of the fallen kingdom hung from cracked pillars, reminders of a dynasty that had ruled for generations. At the center of it all stood the queen. She had not fled. There had been nowhere to go. When the palace gates were finally broken, the surviving members of the court were gathered together under armed watch. Advisors, servants, and noble families who had lived within the palace walls were now prisoners inside the very place that had once protected them. The conqueror who entered the palace that morning was a commander of the invading army, acting on behalf of the expanding power of the Mongol Empire. He walked slowly through the throne hall, studying the surroundings with calm authority. His soldiers stood along the walls while the surviving members of the royal court waited in silence. No one spoke. Everyone expected the same outcome that had followed countless other conquests throughout history: execution. For many defeated rulers, the end came quickly after capture. Killing the royal family eliminated any future claims to the throne and ensured that rebellion would be harder to organize. But something unusual happened that morning. The commander looked at the queen, not as an enemy to be destroyed, but as something else. A witness. Someone who had seen the fall of the kingdom with her own eyes. Instead of ordering her death, he gave a different command. She would live, but she would not return to the city. She would not rule again, and she would never leave the empire that had just destroyed her world. The decision confused many people in the palace. Even the conqueror's own officers exchanged uncertain glances. Why keep her alive? The answer was simple, though cruel. A living queen was more powerful than a dead one. Her survival would serve as a permanent reminder of what had happened to the kingdom. As long as she lived under imperial control, the population would understand that their old dynasty was truly finished. She was no longer a ruler. She had become a symbol. Within days, preparations began for her journey. The queen would be taken far from the ruins of her capital and brought to a distant imperial court. There, inside the vast territories of the Mongol Empire, she would live out the rest of her life surrounded by foreign soldiers, unfamiliar traditions, and constant watch. She had survived the massacre, but survival had come with a price. From that moment forward, the queen was no longer a prisoner of war. She was something far more unusual in the brutal world of conquest. A living reminder that her kingdom had once existed and that it had been completely erased. Within days of the city's fall, the preparations were complete. The queen would not remain in the ruined capital. The conquerors understood that keeping her there could become dangerous. Loyalists might attempt to rescue her. Rebels could gather around her as a symbol of resistance. So the decision was made quickly. She would be taken far away, beyond the lands where her name once carried power. The morning of her departure arrived quietly. No ceremonies. No royal farewell. Only a guarded caravan waiting outside the broken palace gates. The streets of the capital were still scarred by the battle. Burned houses lined the roads, and the markets that once buzzed with life now stood empty. As the queen stepped into the courtyard, soldiers surrounded her on all sides. Some were mounted. Others walked beside the wagons carrying supplies for the long journey ahead. Beyond the palace walls, a small crowd had gathered. Citizens who had survived the attack stood silently as the caravan began to move. For them, the sight was heartbreaking. Their queen, the woman who once appeared beside the king during festivals and royal ceremonies, was leaving the city under guard. Not as a ruler, but as a captive. She did not cry. She did not speak. She simply looked once more at the palace towers rising behind her. It was the last time she would ever see them. The journey that followed stretched across vast territories controlled by the conquering empire. The armies that had destroyed her kingdom served the expanding power of the Mongol Empire, an empire that now ruled lands from Eastern Asia to the distant plains of Europe. Traveling through such an enormous domain meant crossing deserts, rivers, mountains, and endless grasslands. Day after day, the caravan moved forward. The queen rode inside a guarded wagon, escorted by soldiers who rarely spoke to her. Villages passed in the distance. Foreign cities appeared along the road. Everywhere she looked, the world felt unfamiliar. Different languages, different customs, different banners flying above city walls. The deeper they traveled into imperial territory, the more she understood what the conquerors intended. This was not simply exile. This was permanent removal. The farther she moved from her homeland, the less chance there was that she would ever return. Yet something unexpected happened during the long journey. The soldiers guarding her began to realize something about their prisoner. Despite everything she had witnessed, the massacre, the destruction of her capital, the loss of her throne, she carried herself with remarkable dignity. She did not beg for mercy. She did not curse her captors. She remained calm, composed, almost regal. For warriors used to seeing defeated rulers collapse in fear or despair, her quiet strength was unusual. Some began to treat her with cautious respect, but respect did not change her fate. Weeks later, the caravan finally approached its destination. Ahead of them rose the massive capital of the empire that had conquered her world. A city larger than any she had ever seen. A place where rulers commanded armies powerful enough to destroy entire kingdoms. And somewhere inside those enormous palace walls, she would spend the rest of her life, far from home, under watch, and never allowed to leave. When the caravan finally reached the imperial capital, the queen realized something immediately. This city was unlike anything she had ever known. Its walls stretched for miles. Its markets overflowed with merchants from distant lands. Warriors from many different cultures walked the streets, wearing armor and clothing she had never seen before. This was the heart of the vast territories ruled by the Mongol Empire, a place where conquered kingdoms from across continents were connected under one powerful authority. At the center of the city stood the imperial palace. Towering gates opened into enormous courtyards where soldiers trained and royal officials moved constantly between buildings. Silk banners hung from tall wooden pillars, and guards watched every entrance. It was here that the queen would live, not in chains, not in a dark dungeon, but inside the palace itself. The conquerors had decided that she would remain within the imperial court, under constant supervision. Her chambers were comfortable, almost luxurious. Servants were assigned to her. Fine clothing was provided. Food from the palace kitchens arrived each day. To an outsider, it might have looked like she was being treated with honor. But the truth was different. Every hallway had guards. Every gate was watched. Every movement required permission. The palace was beautiful, but it was still a prison. The queen quickly understood that she was not there by accident. Her presence served a purpose. The empire wanted a living reminder of the kingdom it had destroyed. As long as she remained under their control, any rebellion from her homeland would feel pointless. The people who once followed her dynasty would know their queen now lived under imperial authority. Her story had become a political message. Weeks turned into months. Months slowly became years. The queen adapted to life inside the palace. She learned the language spoken by the imperial court. She observed the customs and rituals that governed daily life among the empire's nobles. And as time passed, something unexpected began to happen. The people around her started to notice the quiet strength she carried. She never spoke bitterly about the past. She never begged to return home. Instead, she listened. She watched. She understood the complicated politics of the imperial court. Some officials began to respect her intelligence. Others admired her composure. Even the guards who once watched her as an enemy started to see something different. She was no longer simply a defeated queen. She had become a survivor. But despite the growing respect she earned within the palace walls, one rule never changed. She could walk the gardens. She could attend certain court ceremonies. She could speak with nobles and advisors. But she could never leave the capital. Beyond those enormous gates lay the open world. And somewhere far away beyond deserts and mountains stood the ruins of her old kingdom. A place she would never see again. The empire had allowed her to live. But her freedom had been taken the moment the palace gates closed behind her. And they would never open for her again. Years passed inside the imperial capital. The queen who had once ruled beside a king now lived quietly within the palace of the empire that had destroyed her world. The memories of that terrible night never left her. The burning city, the broken palace gates, the loyal guards who had fallen defending the throne. Those moments stayed with her long after the empire moved on to new wars and new conquests. But life inside the palace continued. Courtiers came and went. Generals returned from distant campaigns. New advisors gained influence while others disappeared from power. Empires were always changing, even at their strongest. And through it all, the queen remained. At first, she had been treated as a defeated ruler, a living symbol of a kingdom that no longer existed. But over time, something unexpected happened. Her quiet dignity and intelligence began to earn respect within the imperial court. She listened more than she spoke. She observed the rivalries between nobles. She understood the delicate balance of power that shaped decisions inside the palace. Slowly, people began to seek her advice. Not openly, not officially, but in quiet conversations within palace gardens or private chambers. Some wanted insight into the lands her kingdom once controlled. Others were curious about the customs and traditions of the people who had lived under her rule. In this strange way, the queen who had lost everything became something else entirely. A bridge between two worlds. She carried the memory of a fallen kingdom, Yet she lived within the empire that had replaced it. Inside the vast territories of the Mongol Empire, cultures from many conquered lands were slowly blending together. Merchants, diplomats, scholars, and travelers passed through the capital from every direction. The empire was growing into something larger than a single culture or dynasty. And within that complex world, the queen's story quietly became part of its history. She never returned home. The ruins of her capital remained far beyond the horizon, separated by mountains, deserts, and time itself. But she did not disappear from memory. Servants in the palace whispered about the foreign queen who had survived the massacre. Nobles spoke of the calm dignity she had shown even in defeat. Some said she carried herself with the same quiet authority she once had on her own throne. History rarely records the private lives of women who lived through the fall of empires. Their stories were often overshadowed by the battles and rulers that filled the chronicles of conquest. But the queen who witnessed the destruction of her kingdom left behind a different kind of legacy. Not one written in victories or battles, but in survival. She had seen her world collapse. She had been taken far from her homeland, and she had lived the rest of her life inside the empire that replaced it. A witness to history, a survivor of conquest, and a woman the empire would never allow to leave.